Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the third and final morning of the Future of Work Summit. I'm delighted to have you all for I think our most popular topic of the conference so far, social protection in the age of AI. I am Katrona Suri. I'm Executive Director of the Task Platform, Thinking Ahead on Societal Change. We are a platform hosted here at the Graduate Institute that aims to bring together the international organizations in Geneva together with a host of other stakeholders to, as our name says, think ahead on large societal transformations that are heading our way. And I think one societal transformation that's really at the forefront of all of our minds is the technology transformation that we're undergoing right now. So I am really thrilled to have with me on our panel today, Sandy Chong, who's the chair of the ASEAN Business Alliance and adjunct professor at Curtin University in Australia. Richard Baldwin, professor of international economics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute and co-chair of our Task Platform.
And the gender balance guy.
And the gender balance, exactly. We have a token male on each of our panels. And we have Janine Berg, senior economist from the International Labour Organization. I would like to jump right in because we have an hour ahead for a fast and furious discussion, and we hope to save time for questions from and discussion with all of you at the end as well. Our conference over the last 3 days has been taking place alongside the International Labour Conference at the International Labour Organization, just up the hill at the Palais des Nations, where they are getting into the nitty-gritty of tripartite negotiations around different elements related to work. We are shadowing those topics in a slightly different form and format, bringing a future-focused lens to those conversations. So we've spoken about, over the last 3 days, about just transitions. We've spoken about apprenticeships and pathways to work. And today we're speaking about social protection, which is the topic at hand at the ILC. So I wanted to ask Janine if she could kindly give us some headlines around the content and the significance, what's at stake at the on the subject of social protection and labor protection at the ILC this year.
Thanks, Katrina. So yes, what we're having right now at the conference is a recurrent item discussion on labor protection. So labor protection is part of social protection. The way it's conceived in the ILO, we have social protection and it has two branches, labor protection and also Social Security and all of the different types of Social Security entitlements that come about. And the reason why they're put together is because you can't have the social protection or the Social Security aspect without labor protection. You can't have redistribution without distribution. If you don't have enough jobs and you don't have enough people making a living wage, secure contracts, all of these things within their job, then that would put too much of an onus on the Social Security systems. So labor protection is really the bread and butter of the ILO. It was why the ILO was founded in 1919. Our first convention was on hours of work. So this is about really a lot of the real fundamental issues that all of us face in our daily lives when we go to work. So it deals with wages. It deals with working time, so restrictions on hours, overtime pay, rest periods, leave periods, maternity protection, also parental leave, employment protection. So under what rights can you be dismissed? Protection so that you're not dismissed because you're pregnant or part of a trade union. And then also some new issues which are really relevant to our topic today, such as workers' personal data. This has become something that's a concern with people in this age of AI. So yeah, so the discussion at the conference, it's something that occurs every 8 years. They're looking at the trends in the world in this area, looking at basically from 3 dimensions. To what extent is it inclusive? Are there people that are left out? In the past, agricultural workers, domestic workers, other occupations have been left out of labor protection. So that's something that countries are starting to correct. Is it adequate? Is it set at a level that really gives the rights and protections that people need? And is it effective? You know, a lot of countries have beautiful laws, but the laws aren't applied in practice. So we're also looking at that angle of effectiveness. And the delegates there will be, you know, discussing what's been done in their countries, what needs to be done, and setting the agenda for the ILO in the years to come on these issues.
Thank you, Janine. So Richard, I'd like to come to you to bring to life the second half of our title of the conversation today on AI. You've been over the years doing a lot of thinking about technology will reshape the workplace and therefore economies. How do you think this new wave will be different from previous waves? I think you've got a couple of slides to illustrate that as well.
That's right. Thank you very much. So let me just say how wonderful it is to talk about the future of work to a room full of future workers. My normal venue, it's the future of pensioners, but I can see all of you are actually going to be concerned about all the stuff we're talking about today. So let me just first start by saying we are talking about the future, and that means I'm making it up. There is no knowing about the future. So I'm going to lay out some logic and thinking about it, but don't listen to what I say is going to happen. Listen to the logic I'm using to predict what's going to happen, because you're the ones who are going to have to decide what to do. What does it mean for your career? What does it mean for your educational choices now? So it's the logic that I'd like you to listen to, not the prediction so much. But with that, what I'd like to do is start with debunking something that I detect is quite common in the mainstream discussion of AI, and that is AI will be inequalizing in the workforce, just like technological advance always has been. That's the way a lot of people, you know, technology, AI, all that sort of has been bad in the past, it's going to be bad in the future. So I'd like to disrupt that flow by bringing you back to the first technological breakthrough in the modern era, and that was mechanization based around steam power. And I want to argue with this slide that it was fundamentally equalizing for 100 years, and that the connection between technological progress and inequalizing impacts started in the 1970s and has been going on for 40, 50 years. So there's no particular reason that every single technological advance is inequalizing. It's not true. And I'm going to provide a little framework talking about heads and hands to argue that the one that's going forward is going to be equalizing. So here, what we have in the chart is the UK income share going to the top 5% of income earners from 1688 to 2009. Wouldn't it be great to be an economic historian and work with data from 1688? I mean, of course, they were probably, you know, I mean, whatever. So the first bit where the dots are going up a little bit, up to 1867, the technology was inequalizing. And historians call that the first industrial revolution, which primarily involved iron, coal, textiles, a few things like that, where they went from handwork to mechanical work, but only in a very small number of industries. And that was slightly inequalizing, in part because value creation shifted from land, and there were not that many landowners, to capitalists, and capitalists started getting rich in addition to landowners. But from 1870 or so, the second industrial revolution started, where firms started using science in industry. And it brought in chemistry and dyes. It brought in electricity. It brought in artificial, processes that made better steel and things like that. So that was the massive industrialization. As you can see, from 1867 down to 1978, the equality rose. In other words, inequality fell. And then something radically happened around the 1970s. And if you go to the left side of the slide, the first one, this tech shock, it was called mechanization at the time. And what it did was provide more power to hand workers, or if you will, it put the power in manpower. So if you think about somebody trying to drill holes in wood, before it was by hand. Now you had a steam engine in the factory and a cable, and you had a power-driven drill, but you had to have a human controlling that drill. But the human who was controlling that drill was becoming massively more productive than before. And the price of the outputs and the goods fell so much that people bought so much more that even though you needed fewer workers per piece of work, there was so much more work that there was actually a massive increase in employment in industry, moving from agriculture to industry. So that was what that first tech. Now, what did it do for head workers? The people, you saw, the Dickens movies, the Ghost of Christmas, they're scribbling away with it didn't do much for them. This mechanization didn't help head workers. And as a consequence, it was equalizing. It rose up the hand workers who were behind. It didn't help the head workers. Now, from 1978, we had the ICT shock, the information and communication technology, which was entirely different. In particular, they put a computer chip on a robot arm, and that started providing substitutes for hand workers. All through the economy, they started automating things that people used to do with their hands, parking attendants, people working in shops, checkout clerks, the whole thing. There was mechanization of hand workers. The same technology created great tools for head workers. That's you guys. All the stuff you use that makes you way more productive than you were before. You don't have to write out your papers by hand and have somebody type them or type them yourself. You're just doing it directly. But the trick was you needed a university degree to make these tools work. So what this one led to a skill twist, which made head workers more productive and therefore higher paid, and hand workers substituted away. So inequality rose. Now, if I could get the next slide, the question is, what will AI do? And what I want to do is show a very, very recent piece of research on the impact of ChatGPT on performance by levels of skills of workers. And by recent, I mean, this came out on Vox yesterday, my website. So you can read about the study and things like that by Noy and Zhang. So what they did, and the theme is ChatGPT's equalizing impact. So shock number 3 was AI. And this competes with more experienced head workers and has less impact on hand workers. So what this experiment did was it took a bunch of mid-level professional workers in a variety of disciplines in a randomized controlled trial that they did online through work. And they gave them 2 tasks. Task 1, which was on the horizontal axis, and they were graded by other humans from the same task platform in the same area. And then they gave them a second writing task, which is task 2 on the vertical axis. And some of the people were allowed to use ChatGPT and some of them not. And as you can see, the grades, the green things, are highest for the ones who scored the worst on the first task. And if you think about what ChatGPT does, it's substituting for experience-based pattern recognition, which is what you need to be a good writer. The only way to learn to write is to write a lot. And some people have, some people haven't. The ones who haven't are now way better writers than they were before. The people who are like the Oxford PPE graduates, who've been trained their entire life to write, doesn't make much difference. And actually, it's a little bit lower. That's not statistically significant, but it's interesting that it actually lowered them. So I'm going to make the argument that generative AI will be equalizing in society, because what it's providing is a substitute for experience-based pattern recognition. This AI is data-based pattern recognition. And some of the best jobs, most highly paid jobs in the world are experience-based pattern recognition. That's why people who have 10 to 20 years experience earn more than the other ones. But this will equalize that. And I think it will create an entire range of mid-level professional jobs where, for example, a nurse using an AI becomes an almost doctor, where a road engineer using an AI becomes almost an engineer, where a paralegal using an AI becomes almost a lawyer, all through the professions, architects, draftsmen, whatever. It will raise up the people who are average and therefore compete with the highest level people. So I think it will be fundamentally equalizing in the white collar professions. So I don't know what that means for you guys, but the only thing I will close with is what I started teaching this year in my class. And the one thing that the students all tweeted out after I said was that ChatGPT won't take your job, but somebody using ChatGPT may. So whatever the takeaway is here is this stuff is a tool that you have to master because it's going to be table stakes in any profession that involves content generation. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I love listening to Richard because I have the I'm in the privileged position to hear him speak often, and every time he speaks, there's something new. So you're getting insights hot off the press. And we're going to turn back to Janine now for insights, I think, not even on the press yet. Janine, could you tell us a little about your recent research into ChatGPT and the insight on particular impacts on workers and in different geographies?
Yeah, sure. So with my co-author, Pavel Gimrich, who's in the corner over there, we've been looking at ChatGPT, trying to analyze how it could affect the world of work and precisely what are the occupations that are going to be affected. And so this is still work in progress, but basically we've based our analysis on the ISCO 4-digit occupations. So there's 436 4-digit occupations with detailed explanation of the tasks. And with that information, we've asked ChatGPT to give us automation scores. So if you could show the first slide. Thanks. Okay, so what we're doing in this paper is first looking at which of the occupations that are most affected. And then another question, how are they affected? Are they going to be, or is it people that are going to be replaced, or is it people that are going to be using it in your work, like Professor Baldwin described? And then the next step is then to transfer this using the global employment estimates of the ILO, look at what are the potential employment impacts in different parts of the world. So right up here, this is the first analysis, and this is the main 1-digit groups by ISCO occupations. So on the top right there, you'll see clerical support workers. And you can see that clerical support workers are in 2 lines. And these 2 lines are what we're calling the highest exposure to ChatGPT. Okay, so 75% is the top line. That's really high exposure. And then we have the middle line of 0.5. And then if you see the other occupations, many of those are elementary occupations below because it requires a lot of manual dexterity. So it's not going to be affected. Plant and machine operators, you know, they're going to be, some of their tasks can be used with ChatGPT, but the majority of their work won't be. Service and sale workers, if you look at some of those service and sale workers might have some effects, but a lot of them will just have some slight exposure, but not major exposure. And then if you look at professionals, managers and professionals, so this is in the left column. So 1, 2, 3 down, the left one is managers. You see, again, they're kind of up there. They have some exposure with some of their tasks, but not as much of exposure as clerical support workers. And then underneath them is professionals. And again, kind of the same trend. There's certainly some of their tasks are exposed to ChatGPT, but a lot of what they do is not exposed. So really exactly what Professor Baldwin was saying. You can use it for some of the things you're doing, but it doesn't mean you're still needed for other of your tasks. If you go to the next slide, what we did then was just take all of the tasks and then aggregate the automation scores. So if you think of a task like record keeping, right? So that could be a task that clerical support workers do, maybe even some managers, professionals do, maybe some plant and machine operators do. But then we looked at how many of those tasks that could be automatable were in each of those big occupational groups. And so the green is those that are medium exposure, and then the red is high exposure. And again, you really see clerical support workers stands out. So it shows that the ChatGPT is very much a technology that can basically replace or augment those tasks that that ChatGPT has the ability to do with its technology. And you see very clearly what is the occupational group that's affected. If you turn to the next slide, and this is just to give you a little bit more detail. So here within these 2 categories, and here we're comparing managers with clerical support workers. So again, this red line is the 50, the mean. So Anybody who has the distribution of their tasks to the right means that they're really high exposure. So if you take that first row on the right there, clerical support workers, typists, and word processing operators, basically all of their tasks are then have high exposure to ChatGPT. So the chances of them being automated are very high. If we look though on the left column with managers, you see that most people in the managers column, yes, they have some of their tasks that can be replaced by ChatGPT technology, but a lot of them that are still on to the left of this red bar. And so what we're trying to show is, who can be affected. Already some of the tasks, some of the occupations, excuse me, on the right column of clerical support workers have already been exposed. I mean, if we have the one occupation there of secretaries, for example, there aren't nearly as many secretaries today as there were back in the 1970s before word processing applications came out. So this is something that's been a process that's been ongoing, but it's being now accelerated with ChatGPT. So the next part of our analysis, and we're not showing this yet because it's still work in progress, is to then apply these occupational codes to countries of different levels of development. And what we know is that, of course, in countries at lower levels of income, your economic diversification is less. You have many more people in agriculture. You have many more food vendors, many more transport workers. So the percentage of people that will be affected by ChatGPT is much lower. So we know that really it's going to be more of a high income country effect. But at the same time, it does raise some questions. It raises two questions, and there's some positive and some negative. On the one hand, it gives people access to technology that they can use and they can become more productive. And so that's a really good thing. On the other side, you have countries that still don't have very good internet access. Electricity goes out. The access to ChatGPT technology isn't good. So there could be the potential that you're going to increase this digital divide that already is so large between countries at different levels of economic development. And the other concern a little bit is that when countries have gone from poor to rich, you've seen a transformation in the occupations that are present in countries. And clerical support workers is something that is at a kind of a medium level of economic development. If you think of call centers, there's been many call centers, for example, in the Philippines, or in many countries, in many middle income countries. So there is this potential that some of these good jobs in countries that have been created in the past decades could have the potential to be replaced. Now, it depends very much how it's being used. There's actually a recent paper that came out by some economists there where they did actually an analysis of Filipino call center that was servicing the United States. But there in that call center, the people had to actually speak to the customers that phoned. And the ChatGPT was being used to give them, to prompt them with better answers on how they should respond to the clients that called in. And it found, just like what you were saying, it found that those workers that had less tenure, weren't as experienced, very quickly could have the same performance as some of the higher, more experienced workers because they were using this technology. So that could turn out well for workers, or it could turn out poorly. It's very hard to tell. We don't have crystal balls, but I think the most important thing is just to be aware of some of these transformations. And then, perhaps in our next round of discussion, we could discuss a little bit what this means for labor protection. And what are the new jobs that are going to be created, and those new jobs have the protections that they need? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janine. Really interesting to bring this to life down at that granular level. And I'd like to turn to Sandy next to take us granular in a different perspective down to a specific geography. Sandy works across Southeast Asia, Australia, the ASEAN region. So could you bring to life for us how these technologies are being perceived and responded to across that region? Yeah, it will.
Thank you very much, Katrina. So it's a pleasure to be here and representing a region that is going to be quite significant for future economy, not just in the region, but also for EU. 60% of the world's population is in this time zone. and we are actually walking or going into the Asian century. So whether you are Asian or you're non-Asian, I'm pretty sure a substantial amount of you are going to find employment or do business in Asia in the next 5 to 10 years. It's going through massive change, and this AI is going to disrupt about $960 billion worth of income for workers. Nearly 50% of the workers in this region will be affected. Having said that, it's going to be offset by the economic impact, which is about 960 billion as well. So it's a really interesting time. Having said that, only about 400 digital users at the moment in this region, and about 150 million of them have no access to internet, to technology, AI. And more interestingly, over the last 2 years, because of COVID and because of the pandemic, about 60 million of them get a taste for digital access, internet, wireless payment, and so on. So our adoption in digitization, in technology, in AI is really outpacing the literacy. So think about this region that has a massive number of users, potential consumers, and yet they are using technology like babies. So that means they will be subjected to all kinds of abuse. And so the literacy really needs to go up. And more importantly, we all know that for any uptake of technology, any uptake of digitization, you need three things, 3 C's, I call it. First, collaboration, and then convergence, followed by capital. In terms of investment, Asian countries are starting to understand that this is something that will happen, and they need to get themselves ready, the businesses ready, and also the workforce. But we all know that technology impact on economies and countries differently. So if you're in the retail sector, e-commerce sector, or if you're in manufacturing or materials, this is going to be fantastic for you. But if you're in the farming sector, or if you're in construction or building, which is mostly owned by small business owners, families, it's going to be a real challenge. And we all know that the use of technology, particularly AI, is subjected to interpretation and obviously implementation. And a lot of that has got to do with culture, right? The way we consume our technology, the way we interact, and the way we communicate. And so the ASEAN countries and also even the larger part of Asia, like China, Korea, Japan, they're all aware that they need to adopt this real fast. And obviously, in some countries, they have the scalability like China and the money to do this. But in some other countries like the Southeast Asian country, other than Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, they're putting a lot of investment in it. The rest of the other regions are really still at a very early stage. So the question would be, how do we level this playing field so that there is no digital divide? Already there are digital divide, wealth gaps in Asia. And more importantly, the real concern here is how is this going to impact on not just the regional policies? We talked about the trade policies yesterday. We all know that in some of these Asian countries, they still haven't abolished forced labor, like in Korea, Japan, Laos, Myanmar, and China. They still have that. So it's really incumbent on the governments to make sure that when they do these regional trade agreements, they take into consideration of that. Obviously, the governments themselves also needed to make sure that their own workforce. So for example, about 6 unions, workers' unions, have got together and tried to negotiate for this RCEP agreement, which is the largest trade agreement in the world, which is called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So they wanted to have more clarity on how this particular regional agreement is going to impact on the workforce. How is this going to impact on government sector workforce? Because again, in a lot of countries, they employ a lot of people in the departments and federal and state level. So that's a real concern. I was formerly born in Singapore, and I lived more than half my life in Australia. So the Australian government is also involved in this region, and they're very interested in collaborating with Asia, obviously gaining a lot from it as well. But I think I'll also leave for the Q&A session later on. But essentially, I think people need to understand that when you look at using AI in a lot of cultures, particularly Asians, it's really got to do with how you develop trust. So when it comes to trust, it's not just about the coding and the security, how you highlight this, how you make it transparent, but also who is providing the services, right? Who is providing the services? And more importantly, the institutions that are providing these services. Are they trustworthy? How do you demonstrate trustworthiness, right? So we've already seen how some of these use of AI, for example, in Holland, has impact on thousands of people. So the scandal came out recently. The workers or the citizens weren't able to access child welfare or childcare welfare. And you're looking at people really experiencing huge stress to a point where they kill themselves. It was a huge scandal. And it's all because these algorithms that are being set in AIs can be discriminatory to certain races, to certain culture. So again, I would like to remind everyone, 60% of the world's population is in that region. And unfortunately, more than 50% of them are still subjected to modern slavery. So this is going to have a huge impact on people, human beings.
Thank you, Sandy. I think we're in a relatively rare position in Geneva where also 50% of our panel is from the region. So you have a Malaysian and a Singaporean sitting next to each other, which doesn't happen so often. There are two jumping off points. I'm deciding who to go to first. Maybe I'll come back to Richard because Sandy spoke about the RCEP agreement and the implication this has on trade relations between countries, which is obviously your core field of thought. So maybe you'd like to reflect on that.
Sure. Thank you very much. So what I'd like to pick up a little bit on how AI will interact with trade. And they are somewhat different between trade, but typically, especially with ICT and mechanization, they affected first automation in a country, and then they affected globalization between countries. And I think that same thing's going to go on now. So let me just start with that experiment I talked about before. So as it turns out, that experiment was organized online. And the way they found the workers in HR and accounting and analysis, they got different types of professional workers, was they went on to an online platform where you can hire these workers, and they actually hired them online. So what you can see is, although they probably, actually, we don't know which country they were in, but they could have been in a separate country. So the question here was, what happens when you combine generative AI and online workers? So this experiment was actually a combination of both potentially globalization and AI. And I think it's fairly easy to see that generative AI, by leveling the productivity field, is actually making emerging market clerical workers or office workers more competitive with advanced economy workers. So in some sense, this will make it easier for offices to cross borders and firms, of white-collar firms in rich countries, to integrate workers from emerging markets who are paid radically less. So let me just mention a little bit just to get, dial in, what does it mean radically less? I think, looking out at the audience, and I think many of you know more about this personally than I do, but anyways, for the rest of you, $5 an hour, let's say 5 Swiss francs an hour, which are approximately the same thing now. That sounds like a ridiculous amount of money in Switzerland. So for instance, the workers at McDonald's get 24, 25 francs an hour. That's that's the low paid stuff in Switzerland. So 5 francs sounds ridiculous. But if you go to almost every country in the world and you get $5 an hour and you work 2,000 hours a year, that's $10,000. And in most countries of the world, that's a middle class living. $5 an hour providing a middle class living. Now just think about when you're organizing your offices and you're trying to decide who put into your remote teams. The remote people in Switzerland getting paid 30 francs an hour using ChatGTP, or people in Nairobi earning $5 an hour using ChatGTP. So I think it will accelerate this whole thing. To talk about the trade, agreements, my point, which is somewhat non-mainstream, is I don't think we need trade rules very much. They won't affect things very much. And my main prima facie evidence is that India's service export success happened without signing a single free trade agreement, without the WTO changing anything in the rules that hadn't been changed in '94. So in some sense, this buying and selling services, especially business to business, is not affected by trade barriers, hasn't been in the past. So we don't actually need to do something actively to remove the trade barriers. They're not there. So maybe they'll get put in, but unlike trade in goods and agriculture and things like that, it's really not multilateral cooperation and the leap to it. The other thing I would just stress is that there is no AI without humans behind it. As many of you will have tried ChatGTP, and you know the one thing you can't do is just ask it a question and then pump out whatever it does without checking it. That's a very bad idea, especially if you're a student. And but that means that there needs to be a human combined with the AI. So the question is if the AI and tools are being employed in advanced economy offices, but the human behind the AI who's doing the exceptions is in a high education, low wage country like, Kenya, there's a lot, Indonesia's another one, et cetera. So I think it's a combination of the AI and globalization. But my takeaway is we don't actually need that much more multilateral cooperation to make it happen.
I'll come to Janine on that point to bring us full circle back to social protection. So there may not be multilateral cooperation needed on the trade agreements to reduce trade barriers. What do you think around the topic of social protection and labor protection in this space?
Yeah, so this is a really tricky issue because we're in a system, I mean, especially the ILO, but really the world is set up where the ILO sets labor standards. Many countries adopt our labor standards, but everything in the labor market is through national legislation. And so now we have a situation where, for example, a lot of these workers on platforms that you talked about, where the worker could be in one country, maybe the client is in another country, and then the platform's in another country. And how should that worker be paid? Should that person be paid the minimum wage in the client's country, the platform's country, their country? Maybe it should be their country, but then how do we regulate that? And so these are really, really tricky questions because one thing is pay, but there's also a lot of other issues. For example, occupational safety and health. A lot of the work that some people are doing on these platforms is content moderation, to make sure that our social media sites are clean and they don't have pornography and violence. There is AI, but there's also humans who have to look at some photographs and so some footage and decide whether it should be on a platform or not. For every little bit of technological progress, there's always going to be some humans involved, and there are occupational safety and health risks. There are other concerns. So all of this means that, we do need some labor protections, but right now we're living in a system where we're just having national regulation. Even for other issues like payment of wages. You could work on a platform for a month. The client says they're going to put the money in your bank account and then they don't pay you. And then all you have is an online contact. And what do you do? Where do you go? You go to your local labor court. They don't know who you are. So these are all these issues that really need to be thought at, and they need to be thought at the international level. We're going to be having a discussion at the ILO in 2025, a standard setting discussion on digital labor platforms. So we'll see how the discussion evolves. But it's clear that we are living in an international world, and yet we're nationally regulated, and that's just not working out.
Thank you. I want to quickly open to Q&A because I'm sure there's plenty of questions and reflections in the room. Richard, yes, please go ahead.
Can I just suggest we do a little poll of the audience about usage of this stuff, and then whether they have ever used social protections. First of all, whether they've worked and whether they know that or that they had social protection, just to find out. But if they are.
And
Great.
also one question, how many of them would be happy to have AI as a boss?
All right, so first question. Who has used AI, generative AI in the room for your work? Wow. Yeah. Have you thought about social protection or had need of any sort of social protection in that context of using? Who has thought about that or made use of any sort of worker protection in that context?
I think we have to rephrase that.
Yeah, sorry. please do better, Janine. Help.
Are you concerned about paying too many hours, getting dismissed unlawfully, and having your wages paid?
Thank you.
How many of them have worked?
Okay, how many have you had employment of regular contract? You have to raise your hands a little bit higher.
So it's mostly students.
It's mostly students. That's a good many.
Okay.
And did you appreciate your labor protections while you were working?
Yes.
Yes, let's raise his high. Okay.
And your question, Sandy, was, how many of you would like to have AI as a boss?
No. Oh, we have one hand.
All right. Thank you, panelists.
Very good.
Any questions from the floor? One over here. Do we have a Nishta? Thank you.
Well, I have a question about the future of lawyers. Many of the students here are lawyers, or gonna be lawyers, and so one is for Professor Baldwin. You said we don't need trade agreements, but of course, in legal and regulated professions, there are still quite a few barriers to trade and services. And so, do you see a prospect that there will actually be trade liberalization of those regulated professions, or is it simply something where countries are going to decide unilaterally what to do? And then Ms. Beck, if you could say just a little bit more about the results as they apply to legal services. I don't know whether you have looked into that.
Thank you. Shall we take a couple of questions? Or
Sure,
do you want to do? I think there was one just behind and one at the table there. Take answers.
Hi, I think this also speaks to the future of lawyers situation and goes to Richard. So in manufacturing, I think we can say, and of course you've been thinking about this a lot more deeply than me, but that you go from skilled labor, from highly skilled labor to sort of low skilled labor. I think about car manufacturing to no labor, right? You can get, at some point, you can get factories that are almost fully automated. And to think about how fast can that happen, and would that affect your prospect for redistributive? Because you can say, well, instead of hiring junior lawyers in Canada, I hire junior lawyers in Vietnam or Kenya. But then it's, how many years? What about ChatGPT 10? Do you need junior lawyers at all? And does it mean that just, you have a single person maybe just doing the partner job of looking for contacts and managing an AI that does the actual, what we think of the actual work of the lawyer on its own? Thank you.
Great. And one more question on that.
I think it's still morning. Good morning, everybody. Bianca Merchant from the University of the West Indies, SRIC. So my question is more on the lower end, for university students, because a lot of us in here are university students here for this enriching conversation with you guys. So yes, so for university students, do you think the use of AI such as Chat GPT will decrease the critical thinking skills, the research skills, those type of skills that we would develop in university? Do you think it would essentially make us lazier in a sense, not really developing the skills that we need to just function independently?
Great. Panelists, over to you. Who would like to jump right in? Sandy, go ahead.
The answer is, so I'm addressing the last question with regards to essentially, does ChatGPT makes us dumber? So 15 years ago, when I was teaching at a university, Google, or 20 years ago, yeah, Google was in, and it was the same thing. There were these articles that came out and asked whether Google is making us stupid, right? So essentially, the algorithms work in such a way that it just crawls data and it just churns it out. But what it does is it use academic referencing as a model. So the more people click on that particular link, that means it's more relevant. I think this is just another evolution of the Google, which means you need to, so junk in, junk out, right? So you need to make it more meaningful in order to get meaningful details out there. And as a user of information, like all researchers, right? Two things you must always bear in mind when you do your thesis. Number one, is the data reliable? Number two, is it valid? So I think until AI can do both of that, right, we would still be relevant as human beings. And of course, you know, we're talking about inclusive technology. You're talking about just transition, just fair transition. So you need inclusion. You need people of diversity background to come in and basically say, no, this is not relevant or this is wrong, and report it. Right? And then the information will be a lot more rigorous, a lot more valid. Yeah. I think the other question about the manufacturing and lawyers. So last week when I was in Australia, I chaired a panel session on ESG for the mining sector in the ASEAN region and also Asia and Australia. One of the panelists is actually a lawyer. And she was asking the same question, right? Someone was asking her, does ChatGPT change your job? And she said, yeah, tremendously. I mean, in the past, you need to be reading, you know, boxes and boxes of documents, right? And especially when you're looking at ESG compliance, when you're looking at operating between different jurisdictions with regards to mining laws or compliance. She said ChatGPT really helped her a lot, really cut down the time, really cut down the amount of papers that they need to print out, you know, indirectly saving trees. So I think at the end of the day, if you're a lawyer and if you're operating between different jurisdictions, yes, you may be hiring someone from Vietnam, but obviously you are protecting, say, Australian clients. And obviously different laws would apply differently beyond different jurisdictions. And that's where, again, the humans can come in. And I don't think as yet you are made redundant or irrelevant until maybe the other person in Vietnam fully understands the cultural aspects, the legal aspects of different countries. But you might have a different...
Okay, thanks. Thanks. So I'd like to start and spin out from your idea of what Google did. And there was this question when Google search came out and Wikipedia came out of what would it do? And I felt that it completely changed the mental prowess that was validated, at least in academics. And before, it was really important that you remembered the dates and details of trade agreements, for example. And it was really impressive when somebody could talk about the US-Canada trade agreement and then just mention that it was signed in 1988. But now, you know, there's no bonus for that. It's like 2 seconds away. You can check it while the guy's talking. So it went from knowledge was super important as a background, and then you did the analytics, whereas knowledge was free, facts were free. And so it was more important to piece it together. And so I just to sort of say that that's the sort of thing that might happen with ChatGPT, is not that it undermines all value of a university degree, to go on to your question, but it should reemphasize certain talents. And some people who weren't as capable will become more, and some who had a big advantage will be less. So I think that's an important thing. Also, it's worthwhile saying that ChatGPT is like archaeology. These geniuses who brought it up, they have no idea what it can do. And if I follow it on Twitter with the university, people are finding all sorts of stuff that they can do with this, that the geniuses did not know was in there. So for instance, they did not train it to do translation, but it does very good translation. Who knew? What would they estimate this model of 1 trillion parameters on basically all the text that they could find? And it turns out, like in business schools, people are using it to teach negotiations. Or you can also get it to help you with your poetry, if that's your interest. So anyway, so I think we don't know yet. But so let me talk with the future of lawyers. So the future of lawyers is already there. I mean, there's outsourcing of it's not low skill, but it's sort of repetitive legal things. I talked to a head of a law firm in London. He said they outsource 20% of their legal work to people in Lagos and Nairobi who had the British system, but charged lot less. And there's whole bunches of legal analysis that's already in AI, like e-discovery and checking contracts and stuff like that. So in law is experience-based pattern recognition. And that's what this thing does. So I think it's going to disrupt the profession seriously. But again, you just have to, first of all, you absolutely have to be on top of these tools, because if you're not, you're going to lose your job to somebody who is. But also the talents that are going to be rewarded are somewhat different. But if you, there's so many young people in the room, I have to say something that'll make you guys all happy. That's just the kind of way I am. So old guys have much harder time dealing with this new technology than young people. So at least for the next 5 years, you probably will have an edge on the people who graduated from the into the legal profession 10 years ago. So take advantage of it. The automation, the question about automation, and also there was a certain extent whether artificial intelligence and remote intelligence are substitutes or complements. So I did a paper recently with a Japanese author where we look at the automatability and offshoreability of US occupations using two very standard indices that have been in the profession. In the discussion, normally they talk either about automation or offshoring, but if you put them together, you get what we call the globotics quadrant, where there's some which are both automatable and offshoreable, some which are neither, some which are one or the other. So this idea that will automate away all the, for instance, call center services, that's one of them. Probably most of that will be automated, although you always need humans for exceptions, and also rich people will want to pay extra, or premium customers will get access to humans rather than chatbots. But some of the stuff can't be offshore, so it's really, it's not clear that they're automatic substitutes to each other. The other is, as I mentioned before, I think, for instance, Filipinos who might have an issue with accent, using AI with instant translation means they won't have an accent. So you can have instant translation, not just between French and English, but between accents. And so that I think will be an equalizing. It'll take away a lot of the language differences. And then the last thing about the critical thinking is I think in the medium run, where you've all learned to read and to write essays, probably all of you spent a fair amount of time doing that, you can judge whether Chatty did something right or wrong. And if you have some knowledge about the background, you can check it to see whether it's hallucinating or not. But I wonder, in the long run, just like we lost the ability to do mental arithmetic because we had calculators, and eventually they stopped really training people on a mental arithmetic. If we lose the ability to write by ourselves, we won't have the ability to copy ChatGPT. And then there's fundamentally the scary thing: in 10 years' time, a very large fraction of the text on the internet will have been generated by ChatGPT. And so ChatGPT will be training itself on text it generated. As you can see here, there are various science fiction movies where they take that out. But in any case, I think it is a fascinating topic. Great questions. Thank you. Sorry it took so long.
So you've stolen a lot of my points that I wanted to make. So yeah, the legal profession, certainly you already see a lot of these changes, and I think they're going to continue, and it's obviously going to have more disruptive effects. You still need some lawyers to do some of the more important work. I don't know if all of you saw this article that came out in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago of obviously a very lazy lawyer who used ChatGPT to frame their case, and it turned out that the ChatGPT had invented legal cases. So that's a bad example of how you should use ChatGPT. But of course, in the legal profession, there is, you know, specifically trained AI that can help lawyers, and I think more and more of that is going to be used. And I think it needs to be used in the legal classrooms. I mean, the new generation of lawyers are going to have to be trained on all of this, because it's clear that it's going to be incorporated more and more into legal professions. And I think that's true of more professions. And it comes back to the education point. Besides being a professional, I'm also a mother of 2 teenagers, and it kind of scares me because now with the ChatGPT, my colleague tells me that you can actually take a picture of the math problem and send it to the ChatGPT, and it can solve the math problem for you. I mean, this means that you're not going to really be learning the math. So, or learning how to write the essays, or learning to do all these other things. If I were teaching a class, it means that, you know, I would probably be shifting my class more to in-class assignments and oral presentations. There's already been a big shift in the classrooms towards oral presentations. So I think it's, yes, these skills that we're going to be using in the future are those skills that are not as automatable as some of the skills that ChatGPT can replace. So education systems have to change, and we need to make sure that education systems are on top of this and using this so that the students don't just become lazy, but they actually learn the critical thinking skills that they need, even with this technology that's out there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Did we have any burning thoughts? Yes, we've got a couple of minutes.
So final thoughts with AI. I think ethics is really important. Back in my time in the 70s, I'm giving out my age. When we learn about anything in primary school, high school, we always learn about ethics, right? I think we need to bring back ethics again into the use of these technologies. Government need to make sure that whoever is using it, the government sector people, the private sector people, are fully aware of its consequences and the potential impact that will have on community. With regards to social protection, as a boss AI, it might be interesting. I mean, you know, who knows? He probably wouldn't have any lens when he look at my skills or my talent, right? But when it comes to maybe monitoring how much work I do, maybe I might not like that very much again. So I think the government needs to be involved, you know, and in ASEAN, a lot of governments are already studying AI Academy Institute to look at collaboration, sharing of ideas, and more importantly, training people. But I also think that with regards to capacity building, it's not just for one particular sector. It has to apply across different sectors so that no one is being left behind. Again, we need to use this and do this right. People were saying that Web 1.0 was fantastic in connecting the world. Web 2.0 literally destroyed lives. So Web 3.0, can we do this right? Can we make it sustainable? Can we make it a lot more accessible? And more importantly, close that gap with inequality that we're facing around the world.
Thank you so much. Do we have any final thoughts from Janine or Richard? Yes, please.
I think there really needs to be humans in control. We can't be having AIs that are running the workplaces. I think that's a really scary future. There needs to be human dispute resolution systems. There needs to be humans behind all of this. I mean, one of my biggest fears that we're not getting into in this panel is also the misinformation that this can cause and all of those issues. I mean, that's kind of a different topic, but I think we can't lose the reins on all of this. There needs to be humans that are accountable. There needs to be systems that, you know, they can't be completely transparent, but as transparent as possible. But I think the accountability is really the big issue.
Thank you. Richard, could you bring it home for us?
Okay, so yeah, let me just spin out a little bit what Sandy said about inequality and the impact. So I think it's worthwhile saying that all these effects, whether it's working online and exporting services or whether it's using AI, that's really talking about middle-income people in middle-income countries, because it's not relevant unless you have steady electricity. It's not relevant unless you have internet access. And it's not relevant unless you own a smartphone or a laptop that can do that. And if you have those three things, you are middle class by world standards. So this is by no means a solution to bringing up the poorest people in the world. They're going to be completely outside this sort of thing. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, because creating, a rising middle class for the global world is probably going to do lots of good things. But I think it's worthwhile thinking, what else are we going to do for the bottom billion, so to speak.
Thank you so much. Such a rich discussion, which I will not attempt to summarize because we're at the end of our time. I'll make my life a little easier, but I will tell you what's coming up next, which is an even deeper dive to bring to life what working with artificial intelligence could really look like. So outside in the hallway, you'll see we've got some screens and some tech set up. We have a colleague from Global Vision, one of our great partners, Jan outside, is there ready to, after the coffee break, walk you through a hands-on experience of using text to text, text to image, text to video, generative AI, and then using generative AI to create to create immersive spaces to work in with those, headsets that Apple is now going to make us all wear 24 hours a day. So you can try out that, or the second breakout is back here with Richard, Isabelle Chapuis, and Douglas Stanley, professor from the HEID, the Haute Arts and Design, excuse my French pronunciation, here in Geneva, to bring to life what this could look like on the job in creative industries in the future, and share some work he's been doing and some thinking and experimentation that Isabelle and Richard have been doing in this space. So stay with us. That kicks off at 11, and we have a coffee outside in the meantime. A huge thanks to our panel. And I think this is the last time I speak in this conference, so I'd like to say a huge thanks to the task team. Janita Kalibala, our events manager, is the heart and soul of everything that's been running so smoothly and beautifully. Our Youth Thinking Ahead team, we have 5 students who have been helping us with everything from operations to note-taking to prompting me on questions to jumping into conversations. So a huge thanks to our wonderful Graduate Institute students, to Tamara Pirone, who had CTI that hosts us, and to the rest of the team who've been jumping in. Joan Okitoy, who's loaned to us from GTP, not GPT, Geneva Trade Platform. And Yasmin Chowdhury, who's our project manager, running some of the projects and managing all the cool tech stuff that you're about to experience. So thank you so much to my wonderful team of ladies and one gentleman over here, and Richard for chairing us. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the coffee.